when he said, "She can wait outside." I was 16, holding groceries and a bloody lip. He shut the door on my face and had the audacity to call himself a father. I never forgot the sound of that lock clicking, a sound that told me I didn't belong. 12 years later, an HOA complaint pinged in my inbox, sent by that very same man. He was complaining about my house. He just didn't know it was mine. Yet, my name is Madison Clark, and I am 28 years old. The email arrived at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, a sliver of digital malice wedged between a mortgage pre-approval and a marketing newsletter. The subject line was sterile, efficient, and utterly devoid of the history it carried: official complaint noise violation from 214 Pinecrest. My finger hovered over the trackpad, a tremor running through it that had nothing to do with the caffeine humming in my veins. I knew that address better than I knew the lines on my own hand. It was the house where I'd learned the specific weight of a slammed door. The house where my mother still lived. A ghost in rooms that had long ago ceased to be hers. I clicked it open. The text was brief, filled with the self-important jargon of suburban governance. It spoke of unacceptable decibel levels, disruption to the peace of the community, and strange, percussive sounds emanating from the adjacent property. But it was the signature at the bottom that made the air in my minimalist office grow thick and cold. Sincerely, Harold Dane, Vice President, Pinecrest Homeowners Association. Harold, of course. The title was new, but the tone was timeless. It was the same officious authority he'd wielded over a 16-year-old girl in his living room 12 years ago. I leaned back in my leather chair, the skyline of the city I had conquered for myself framed in the window behind me, and I saw his face, not the aging, jowly face of the man who must have typed this email, but the sharp, florid face of the man who had looked down at me, his voice a low, dismissive growl, and uttered the words that had become the foundation of my entire life. "You're not family." The memory wasn't hazy or dreamlike. It was crystalline, sharp enough to cut. It was a Saturday night in late autumn. Harold was hosting one of his performative dinner parties, meant to impress his colleagues from the insurance firm he managed. The house at 214 Pinecrest was filled with the cloying scent of my mother's pot roast and the sound of forced laughter. I was 16, awkward in a dress my mother had insisted I wear. My role for the evening relegated to serving drinks and clearing plates. I was navigating the crowded living room, a tray of wine glasses in my hands, trying to be invisible. The carpet was thick, a plush trap for a teenage girl's unsteady heel. I stumbled. One glass, filled with a deep red Merlot, tipped and fell, shattering on the polished hardwood floor just beside the hearth. The laughter didn't so much stop as it was sucked from the room, replaced by a sudden, profound vacuum of sound. Every eye turned to me. The wine spread like a wound across the pale wood. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. Then Harold moved. He didn't rush. He walked toward me with a deliberate, measured pace that was far more terrifying than shouting. He stopped in front of me, his shadow swallowing me whole. He looked at the shattered glass, then at the spreading stain, and finally, his gaze lifted to my face. His eyes were small, hard chips of ice, clumsy. He said, the word a quiet indictment. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, but before I could form a single syllable, his hand came up. It wasn't a frenzied, angry strike. It was a slap, precise, controlled, and brutally public. The crack echoed in the silent room. My head snapped to the side, and a sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth. My cheek flared with a heat that felt less like pain and more like a brand. I remember looking past him, my eyes desperately searching for my mother. She was standing by the dining room archway, a dish towel twisted in her hands. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of something: fear, shame, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She looked away. She looked at the floor. She did nothing. In her silence, she made her choice. He was her protector, her provider, her husband. I was just a reminder of a life she'd had before him. a piece of inconvenient baggage. That's when he said it. A guest, a woman with a pearl necklace, had made a small, sympathetic noise. Harold turned his head slightly toward her, a gesture of reassurance, as if I were a misbehaving pet he was handling with firm expertise. "It's fine," he said, his voice smooth as silk. Then he looked back at me. His lip curled in a sneer of pure contempt. "She's not family. She doesn't understand how we do things here." "You're not family." The words didn't just hang in the air. They settled into my bones. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply turned, walked through the stunned crowd of guests, went up the stairs to my room, and locked the door. I packed a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my worn copy of Jane Eyre, and the $300 I'd saved from my part-time job at the library. An hour later, I slipped out the back door, the sound of the party resuming its hollow rhythm behind me. I walked to the bus station and bought a one-way ticket to a city 3 states away, a place where a friend's older sister had an apartment and a spare couch. I never went back. I never spoke to my mother or Harold again. The life I built was forged in the fire of that night. Every success was a silent rebuttal to his dismissal. I put myself through college on a patchwork of academic scholarships and grueling part-time jobs, studying business and finance with a singular, ferocious focus. I didn't have the luxury of a safety net, so I became my own. After graduation, I took a job at a small real estate firm, starting at the bottom, fetching coffee and making copies. But I watched. I listened. I learned the language of deeds and titles, of foreclosures and investment portfolios. I learned that power wasn't just about money. It was about ownership. It was about holding the paper that said something belongs to you, irrevocably. I worked 18-hour days. I saved every dollar I could. I was promoted. Then promoted again, 5 years ago. I left to start my own firm, MC Development LLC, Madison Clark, me. I specialized in acquiring distressed properties, renovating them, and turning them into assets. I was good at it. I was ruthless. I understood better than anyone that a house is more than just walls and a roof. It's a symbol. It's security. It's a place you can't be thrown out of. And now, here it was. An email from the man who had thrown me out, complaining about noise. I reread his prim, officious words, strange, percussive sounds emanating from the adjacent property. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The adjacent property, 212 Pinecrest, the little blue house with the charming porch swing, right next door to the prison of my childhood. Harold didn't know who had bought it 4 months ago, part of a bundled auction lot I acquired through a shell company. He didn't know who had hired the contractors to begin a full-scale gut renovation last week. He thought he was complaining about a stranger, some inconsiderate newcomer who didn't understand community standards. He had no idea he was complaining about me. That strange, percussive sound he heard through his wall. That was the sound of my crew tearing down the past. And the house he was complaining about, that house was mine. Harold's email was a masterclass in passive aggression, honed over decades of small-town tyranny. While we welcome new residents to our community, one sentence read, "It is imperative that the new homeowner at 212 Pinecrest take a moment to familiarize themselves with the established community standards regarding noise and general decorum." The words dripped with condescension. It was the voice of a man who believed rules were for other people to follow and for him to enforce. I read it twice, then a third time, savoring the bitter, familiar tang of his arrogance. He had no idea to whom he was lecturing. With a click, I sent the email to the printer in the corner of my office. The machine hummed to life, a quiet accomplice. While it worked, I swiveled my chair to the credenza behind me and retrieved a heavy leather-bound portfolio. Inside, nestled in protective plastic sleeves, were the documents that represented the last 5 years of my life's work. They were my armor, my arsenal. I laid them on the vast, empty surface of my mahogany desk. The printer slid a single, warm sheet of paper into the tray. I picked it up, his flimsy, impotent complaint, and placed it gently beside the portfolio. The contrast was almost comical. On the left, His words, pixels on a page, signed by the vice president of a glorified neighborhood watch. On the right, the tangible proof of my existence, of my success. The first document was the deed for 212 Pinecrest, the house currently being gutted. The owner was listed not as Madison Clark, but as Northwood Holdings, LLC, a deliberately bland name I'd created for just this purpose, beneath it. I flipped to the second deed, the one that made my heart beat a little faster. It was for 214 Pinecrest, his house, my mother's house, the property I had watched go into pre-foreclosure from a market monitoring app on my phone, a result of Harold taking out a disastrous second mortgage I could only assume was to cover his lavish lifestyle. When the bank finally moved to auction it, I was ready. Northwood Holdings, LLC, purchased both properties in a single, anonymous, all-cash transaction 4 months ago. The current occupant, Harold Dane, was now, technically, my tenant. He just didn't know it yet. His name was nowhere in this portfolio. Here, he was just an occupant, a line item. Looking at the two papers side by side, his complaint, and my deeds, I felt a cold, clean satisfaction. He thought he was a man of power, scolding an unruly neighbor. In reality, he was a mouse roaring at the owner of the entire building. My next move required a different persona. I needed to be the concerned new homeowner, not the calculating investor. I picked up my phone, looked up the number for the Pinecrest HOA, and dialed. I pitched my voice up slightly, injecting a note of worried sincerity I hadn't genuinely felt since I was a child. A harried-sounding woman answered on the third ring. Pinecrest HOA. This is Brenda. Hi. Brenda, I began, letting a little tremor of anxiety color my words. My name is Madison. I'm the new owner over at 212 Pinecrest. I believe I just received a complaint from you. There was a sigh on the other end of the line, a gust of pure, unadulterated weariness that told me everything I needed to know. Oh, Lord. From Mr. Dane, I assume, about the noise. Yes, that's the one, I said, feigning relief. I just wanted to call and apologize profusely. We're doing some renovations, and I told the contractors to be mindful, but you know how it is. I want to be a good neighbor. Is he very upset? Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. Honey, Mr. Dane is always very upset. Don't you worry your head about it. You're performing work during the approved hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., Monday through Saturday. You're following the bylaws to the letter. I've checked. Oh, that's a relief, I said. He just sounded so official, as the vice president and all. Vice president, she snorted, and I could hear the sound of her rolling her eyes through the phone. He basically appointed himself when old Mr. Henderson stepped down last year because no one else wanted the headache. Honestly, he's been impossible lately. An absolute terror. There was a pause, and her voice softened, laced with a hint of small-town gossip and pity. You have to understand. His wife, Mrs. Dane, she's been quite ill, in and out of the hospital for months now. I think it's just getting to him. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. His wife, Mrs. Dane, not my mother, not the woman who gave birth to me, just an attachment, a footnote to his name. My knuckles whitened around the phone. For a single, terrifying second, the carefully constructed dam around my emotions threatened to break. A flicker of concern, an old vestigial instinct, tried to surface. My mother was sick. The woman who had stood by and watched my world crumble was now in a crumbling world of her own. But then I remembered her silence. I remembered her averted eyes. I remembered the choice she had made in that living room. The flicker died out, extinguished by the cold. Hard resolve I had spent 12 years building. Pity was a weakness I had surgically removed from myself long ago. I kept my voice even, smooth, I see. That's a shame to hear. I let a beat pass, a perfect simulation of thoughtful sympathy. Then I added, the words tasting like ice and victory on my tongue. But yeah, he's been impossible for a long time. Brenda, missing the cavernous depth of that statement, just sighed in agreement. You can say that again. Look, you just keep doing what you're doing. As long as you're within the rules. There's nothing he can do but write snotty emails. Welcome to the neighborhood. By the way. Thank you. Brenda, I said, the picture of politeness. You've been a great help. I hung up the phone and stared out the window. The news about my mother settling like a layer of frost over my plans. It didn't change anything. If anything, it clarified the objective. This was no longer just about a house. It was about everything. It was about the silence, the neglect, the quiet betrayals that were so much more damaging than a single, public slap. Harold had spent years curating a life of perfect, orderly quiet, a life where any disruption was immediately quashed. He'd built his little kingdom at 214 Pinecrest, and my mother had been his silent, complicit queen. My plan began to form, not as a blunt instrument of noise, but as a finely tuned psychological operation. I didn't just want to annoy him, I wanted to dismantle his world from the inside out. I wanted him to feel the same creeping, helpless dread that I had felt as a teenager. The sense that the very walls around you are no longer safe. I wanted to make him hear every single thing he had chosen to ignore. The sound of a girl's heart breaking, the sound of a family disintegrating, the sound of a mother choosing a man over her own child. I picked up the phone again and dialed my construction foreman, a man named Sal, who understood two things perfectly: building codes and discretion. Sal, it's Madison Clark. Ms. Clark, everything all right over at the Pinecrest site? Everything is perfect. Sal, I just have a few new instructions, a change in focus. You're the boss. The shared wall between 212 and 214. I began, pulling up the blueprints on my monitor, the one adjoining their master bedroom. I want you to prioritize the demolition and reframing of that wall. I want every nail pulled, every stud replaced. I want it stripped down to nothing and rebuilt from scratch. And I want the industrial sanders working on the hardwood floors in our master bedroom, all day, every day, from 8:01 a.m. until 5:59 p.m. There was a pause. That's aggressive, Sal said, a note of professional admiration in his voice. The noise transfer will be significant. That's the idea. Sal, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. That's the entire idea. This wasn't about being loud. This was about being heard. Harold Dane was about to learn that some sounds, once silenced, don't just fade away, they echo. And my echo was about to become a goddamn earthquake. The following Monday began, not with a bang, but with a profound and deliberate silence. From my downtown office, I had a remote feed to a small security camera I'd had Sal install on the front of 212 Pinecrest. I watched the quiet, tree-lined street of my memory awaken. A car backed out of a driveway. A woman in yoga pants walked a golden retriever. At 7:55 a.m., the street was a picture of suburban tranquility. At 7:59, it was holding its breath. I imagined Harold inside 214, perhaps with a cup of coffee, feeling a sense of victory, believing his stern email had chastened the unruly new neighbor into submission. I watched the digital clock on my screen tick over. 8:00, then 8:01. The sound, even through my laptop's speakers, was glorious. It was a symphony of targeted chaos. The high-pitched, tooth-rattling scream of a reciprocating saw biting into drywall began first, a lead violin of destruction. It was immediately followed by the percussive, floor-shaking thud of a sledgehammer meeting a load-bearing stud, the drumbeat of my revenge. Then came the bass line, the deep, guttural, unrelenting roar of the industrial-grade floor Sander Sal had positioned in the master bedroom, its engine vibrating through the very bones of the house, and, I knew, through the shared wall into Harold's sanctuary. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of a world being systematically unmade. It was the sound of my arrival. The first email landed in the Northwood Holdings inbox at 8:47 a.m. The subject line was in all caps, urgent and official, cease and desist. The body was a frantic, apoplectic mess of legal-sounding phrases he'd likely Googled. He wrote of wanton disregard for community bylaws, unendurable acoustic assault, and threatened immediate legal action. He signed it, as always, with his full, pompous title. I waited a full hour, letting him stew in the cacophony. Then, I typed my reply. It was a template I had drafted the night before, a piece of corporate non-communication so bland and impenetrable it was a work of art. Dear Mr. Dane, thank you for your correspondence. We have received your message regarding the renovation work at 212 Pinecrest. Please be assured that our contractors are operating in full compliance with the Pinecrest Homeowners Association bylaws. Per Section 4, Subsection B, approved construction and renovation noise is permitted between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., Monday through Saturday. We appreciate your patience as we work to improve the property. Sincerely, the management, Northwood Holdings, LLC. I hit send. His reply came back in less than 5 minutes. It was shorter, sputtering with rage. This is not an improvement. This is a deliberate and malicious act of harassment. I am the vice president of this association. I demand you stop this at once. My response was a copy and paste of the previous one, word for word. That was the pattern for the next week. The noise began at 8:01 a.m. without fail and ended precisely at 5:59 p.m. It was a constant, grinding, invasive presence. I imagined him trying to take a phone call, the whine of the saw in the background. I imagined him trying to watch television, the thud of the hammers a constant interruption. I imagined him trying to find a moment of peace in the home he believed was his fortress, only to find the walls themselves were betraying him, channeling the sounds of my progress directly into his ear. He sent emails every day, sometimes 3 or 4. Each one grew more unhinged. He accused us of using prohibited industrial machinery. He claimed we were destabilizing the foundation of his own home. He threatened to call the police, to sue the LLC into oblivion, and to every single email, he received the exact same maddeningly polite reply, quoting the bylaws he so loved to wield against others. I was using his own shield as a weapon, and it was driving him insane. I knew because Sal would give me daily reports. He came out screaming at us around noon. Sal told me over the phone on Wednesday, real purple in the face. I just pointed at my watch and told him we were on schedule. He stared at the shared wall for like a minute, just staring at it like he wanted to burn it down with his eyes. Keep up the good work, Sal, I'd said, a smile in my voice, and give the crew a bonus for me. The breaking point came on Saturday. I knew it would. A full week of relentless, legally sanctioned torment was more than his fragile ego could bear. I drove out to Pinecrest in the late afternoon. Arriving just before 5 p.m., I told Sal to dismiss the crew for the day, to leave the house silent and empty. I let myself in through the back, the air thick with the dust of demolition and the satisfying smell of freshly cut wood. I stood in the skeletal frame of what would be the new kitchen, a clipboard with a punch list in my hand, and I waited. The silence was as pregnant with tension as the noise had been. At 5:15 it came, a furious, frantic pounding on the front door, not the polite knock of a neighbor, but the angry fist of a man who had lost all control. Boom, boom, boom. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed down the front of my blazer. This was the moment, the first real test. I walked through the debris-strewn hallway, my heels clicking softly on the plywood subfloor. I reached the door and turned the knob. He was standing on the porch, his face flushed, his cheap suit rumpled. His chest was heaving, prepared to unleash a torrent of rage on the faceless homeowner or foreman he expected to find. For a second, he didn't recognize me. He just saw a woman, calm and composed, looking back at him. Then his eyes focused. The anger in them faltered, replaced by a wave of pure, slack-jawed confusion. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He saw the 16-year-old girl with the bloody lip. He saw the stranger who had haunted the periphery of his life for 12 years. And he saw the woman standing before him now, a person he could not place in his orderly world. Madison, he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. It was the first time he'd said it in over a decade. I allowed myself a small, sharp smile. It didn't reach my eyes. Noise complaint, I asked, my voice as cool and polished as the marble countertops I planned to install. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. He looked from me to the gutted interior of the house, then back to me. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture he could not comprehend. You live here. The question was so absurd, so perfectly illustrative of his limited worldview, that I almost laughed. He thought in terms of residents, of neighbors. He couldn't conceive of anything else. I held his gaze and delivered the blow that would shatter his foundation. I own here, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of the truth. I tilted the clipboard in my hand just enough for him to see the header on the work order, a simple, elegant logo and 2 words, MC Development LLC. His eyes darted to the paper, then flew back to my face. M.C. Madison Clark. The connection was made. He stared at me, his mouth agape, his entire body rigid with shock. The blustering, self-important vice president was gone, replaced by a stunned, suddenly old man. He was trying to hold on to his composure, to the last vestiges of his authority, but I could see the cracks spiderwebbing across his facade. He was looking at me, but he was seeing a complete reordering of his universe. The clumsy girl he had banished was not only back, she was the one signing the checks. She was the one making the noise. She was the one in control. He stood there, silent and trembling, a man adrift. And as I looked at the pathetic, crumbling figure on my doorstep, I felt the first, true satisfying taste of victory. It was cold and clean, and it tasted like justice. I knew, with absolute certainty, that his collapse had only just begun. The email calling for an emergency session of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association arrived on a Wednesday evening. It was Harold's last, desperate gambit, and the text was filled with a theatrical sense of urgency. He wrote of a grave threat to the peace and character of our community, and an unprecedented level of disruptive activity originating from the property at 212 Pinecrest. The meeting was scheduled for the following night in the clubhouse, a small, sad building by the community pool that smelled faintly of chlorine and stale coffee. This was his chosen battlefield. He believed the rules of this tiny kingdom, the bylaws he had memorized and weaponized, would be his salvation. He thought he could shame and ostracize the anonymous LLC into compliance. He was bringing a knife to a nuclear war. I spent the next 24 hours not in a state of anxiety, but of meticulous preparation. I didn't reply to the HOA's email. I spoke to no one. Instead, I assembled my portfolio, the deeds to 212 and 214 Pinecrest, the articles of incorporation for Northwood Holdings, LLC, clearly listing me as the sole managing member, and the crown jewel, a copy of the final judgment of foreclosure from the county court against Harold Dane, detailing his defaults on the second mortgage that had cost him his home. I slid each document into a crisp, clear protective sleeve. My armor wasn't emotional resilience. It was paperwork. The clubhouse was exactly as I remembered from the handful of holiday parties my mother had dragged me to as a teenager. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unflattering glow on the 20 or so residents scattered on uncomfortable folding chairs. The air was thick with a suburban malaise, a mix of mild curiosity and the distinct feeling that they would all rather be at home watching television. Harold sat at a long folding table at the front of the room, flanked by Brenda, the weary secretary, and a portly balding man who served as the HOA president. Harold looked energized. Self-important, this was his stage. He was the protector of the realm, about to slay a dragon. I slipped in quietly a minute after the meeting was scheduled to begin and took a seat in the back row. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit. My leather portfolio rested on my lap. A few people glanced at me, a new face, but their attention was quickly drawn back to the front as the president tapped a cheap microphone. "All right, folks, let's get this started," the president said, his voice tinny through the small speaker. "As you know, our vice president, Harold Dane, has called this emergency session to discuss a matter of community concern. He gestured to Harold. Harold stood up, clasping his hands behind his back in a posture of forced gravitas. He paced in front of the table, his face a mask of solemn duty. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice resonating with manufactured concern. "I have lived on Pinecrest Street for nearly 15 years. I, like you, have cherished the peace, the quiet, the decency of this community. It is a place for families, a place of respect." He paused for dramatic effect. "But that peace has been shattered." He launched into his tirade. He never used my name, referring only to the new owner or the faceless development company that had purchased 212 Pinecrest. He painted a picture of a relentless, deliberate campaign of noise and disruption. He spoke of sleepless nights and stressful days. He portrayed himself as the victim, a simple resident trying to protect his home and his ailing wife from an inconsiderate, profit-driven corporate entity. "This new owner," he declared, his voice rising in righteous indignation, "is disruptive and profoundly disrespectful to this community and to the values we all hold dear. They hide behind the letter of the law." Starting their assault at 8:01 in the morning and ending at 5:59 at night, a clear mockery of the spirit of our rules. This is not renovation, this is harassment, and I, as your vice president, will not stand for it. He finished to a smattering of sympathetic applause and concerned murmurs. A few people nodded in agreement. He had played his part well. He looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping the room, and for the first time, his eyes landed on me. He didn't recognize me in the dim light of the back row. He just saw a woman in a business suit. He gave me a curt, dismissive nod, assuming I was a lawyer or representative for the company he was railing against, and sat down, looking satisfied. The president cleared his throat. "Well, thank you. Harold, does a representative for the property at 212 wish to respond?" All eyes turned to the back of the room. I waited a beat, letting the silence stretch. Then, I stood up. I didn't walk to the front. I remained where I was, a calm, still point in the sea of shifting bodies and murmuring voices. "I can respond," I said, my voice clear and even, needing no microphone. Harold squinted, leaning forward. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "I am the managing member of Northwood Holdings, the company that owns 212 Pinecrest," I stated simply. The murmurs in the room grew louder. This was better than they had hoped, a direct confrontation. "And with all due respect to Mr. Dane's concerns about noise," I continued, my gaze locked on him, "I think he's focusing on the wrong issue. The real issue here isn't about decibels, it's about ownership." I paused. "To put it simply, I'm the majority property owner on this street." A profound, dead silence fell over the room. The air crackled. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. People weren't just looking at me anymore. They were staring, their mouths slightly agape. Neighbors exchanged confused, questioning glances. Harold's face, which had been flushed with righteous victory, began to pale. "What? What is that supposed to mean?" the president stammered from the front table. I took a slow, deliberate walk to the front of the room, my portfolio held securely in my hand. I stopped not at the microphone, but directly in front of the table, placing myself between Harold and the residents. I opened the portfolio. "It means," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "that my company doesn't just own 212 Pinecrest." I pulled out the second deed, the paper that had changed my life, and placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. 4 months ago, I also purchased the property at 214 Pinecrest through a bank foreclosure auction. The color drained completely from Harold's face. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He shot to his feet, a strangled, guttural sound escaping his throat. "That's a lie," he choked out, his eyes wide with panic. "That's my—" "Was yours," I interrupted, the 2 words slicing through the air like shards of glass. My voice was utterly devoid of emotion. I didn't look at him. I looked at the president. The documentation is all here. The final court judgment, the certificate of title, the recorded deed. It's all public record. The president, looking completely overwhelmed, picked up the deed with a trembling hand. Brenda leaned over, her eyes scanning the document. The room erupted in a chaotic buzz of whispers and gasps. Did he say foreclosure? She owns both houses. That's Harold's place. Harold stood frozen, his entire body shaking. The mask of the confident community leader had been torn away, revealing the terrified, bankrupt man beneath. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for some sign that this was a nightmare. Brenda looked up from the paper, her face a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. She looked at the president and nodded. The president cleared his throat, tapping the microphone again, the feedback making several people wince. According to this, all documents appear to be valid, he announced to the stunned room. Northwood Holdings, LLC, managed by Ms. Clark, now owns both properties. The whispers exploded into a low roar. The story was instantly clear to everyone. This wasn't a dispute between neighbors. This was a hostile takeover. This was something far more personal and brutal. I finally turned my head and looked directly at Harold. His world had crumbled around him in less than 5 minutes, in a public forum of his own making. He stared back at me, his face a ruin of disbelief and utter humiliation. And I smiled. It was not a wide, triumphant grin. It was a small, quiet, and infinitely sharp curve of my lips. It held 12 years of silence, 12 years of planning, 12 years of cold, patient fury. It was a mirror of the slap he had given me, silent and stinging, a delayed payment delivered in full, with interest. He visibly flinched, as if I had physically struck him. The fall had been absolute, and this was still just the beginning. The public humiliation at the clubhouse broke something in him. The aftermath was not loud or explosive, but a creeping, unraveling silence. The first knock came 2 days later. On a Saturday morning, I was at 212 Pinecrest, reviewing blueprints with Sal. It was a tentative, almost hesitant rapping on the door. Sal looked at me, raising an eyebrow. I just shook my head, and we continued our conversation, my voice never wavering as the knocking stopped. He came back that evening, after the sun had set. This time the knocking was more insistent. A rapid series of 3 hard raps. I was alone, sitting on the plywood subfloor of the future living room, and I watched his distorted shadow through the frosted glass of the front door. He stood there for a full 5 minutes before his shadow retreated. The third time was the following Tuesday. It was just a single, heavy, defeated-sounding thud on the door. A sound of utter capitulation. I didn't move. I just listened to the sound of his footsteps walking away. The slow, shuffling gait of a beaten man. Each unanswered knock was a brick I laid in the wall between my past and my present. He had shut a door on me 12 years ago. I was simply returning the favor. In the midst of his silent siege, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I hadn't seen in over a decade, but one I had never deleted. It was my mother. The text was short, stripped of any maternal warmth. A simple, desperate plea. Please, Madison, don't make things worse. I stared at the screen, at the words that so perfectly encapsulated her entire life philosophy: avoid conflict, maintain the peace, no matter the cost. She wasn't asking me to stop for her sake, or for mine. She was asking me to stop for his, to protect the fragile world she had built with him, a world built on my exile. The bitterness rose in my throat, sharp and familiar. I typed my reply with thumbs that were as steady as stone. He made things worse when I was 16. I hit send. She didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. The official email from the Pinecrest HOA arrived the next morning. It was a general announcement to all residents. The subject line was bland. Update to the HOA board. The body was concise. The board has accepted the resignation of Vice President Harold Dane. Effective immediately. We thank him for his service to the community. There was no explanation, no flowery language. It was a quiet, bureaucratic execution. His name, once a symbol of petty authority, had been erased. Later that day, I got a call from Brenda, the HOA secretary, ostensibly to ask a question about the paint color I'd submitted for approval for the exterior of 212. After we'd finished, she paused. "So," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you heard about Mr. Dane, I guess." "I saw the email," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Resigned," she snorted. "He was practically thrown out. After that meeting, my God, people were talking for days. Old Mrs. Gable from down the street said she hadn't seen a man so thoroughly taken apart in public since her first husband's audit. He couldn't handle the humiliation, just couldn't show his face anymore." "That's a shame," I said, the lie tasting sweet. "Is it?" Brenda replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Anyway, your paint color is approved. Have a nice day, Ms. Clark." The true extent of Harold's fall, however, wasn't measured in social disgrace, but in dollars and cents. The foreclosure had wiped out his main asset, but the debts remained. My mother's illness, I learned through a few discreet inquiries, was a cascade of chronic conditions, a slow and incredibly expensive decline. The second mortgage he'd taken out wasn't just for a new car or lavish vacations. A significant portion had gone to cover a mountain of medical bills his insurance wouldn't touch. Now, without the house as collateral, the banks were calling in their markers. He was trapped. And I was there to watch every moment of it. One of the ancillary businesses under the MC Development umbrella was a boutique financial services and brokerage firm. It was a small, highly specialized operation I had acquired 2 years prior, which gave me access to market data and transaction records that were invaluable to my real estate acquisitions. Harold didn't know it existed. He had no idea that when he began the desperate process of liquidating what was left of his life, the paperwork would eventually find its way to my desk. It started small, a portfolio of municipal bonds he'd inherited from his father. The sale order, routed through a major national brokerage, was processed by a junior analyst at my firm. I saw the transaction summary in a daily report. Seller H. Dane. I instructed my analyst to have my firm's investment wing purchase the entire lot through an intermediary. It was a solid, low-risk investment. Next came his prized possession, a restored 1968 Ford Mustang. He kept obsessively polished in the garage at 214 Pinecrest. He listed it with a classic car dealer. That dealer, as it happened, used an escrow service that was a client of my firm. When the bill of sale came through, I saw his name again. I created a new, single-purpose LLC with a name that sounded like it belonged to a wealthy car enthusiast, Vintage Motor Group, and put in an all-cash offer 10% above asking price. He accepted it within the hour. Sal's crew watched from the porch of 212 as a flatbed truck came and hauled the gleaming cherry-red car away. I was dismantling his life piece by piece, buying up the assets that defined his identity, and he was unknowingly funding the renovation of the house next door with the proceeds. The irony was a dark, private joke that I savored every single day. I was no longer the girl he had cast out. I was his creditor, his financier, his silent, anonymous benefactor, and his executioner, all rolled into one. The final piece was a small cabin on a lake 2 hours north of the city. It was the last significant asset he owned free and clear. It was where he and my mother used to go for weekends, a place I had only been to once as a child, before it became their private retreat. When the listing went live on the MLS, a notification pinged on my phone. The listing agent was from a major regional realty group. I made a call to a contact I had there. "There's a cabin," I said. "Just listed. I want it." "It's a hot market." "Madison," he said, "might be a bidding war." "There won't be," I replied. "Put in a full price, all-cash offer, no contingencies, 30-day close. My LLC will be Lakeside Retreat Properties. The seller won't know it's me." The offer was presented to Harold that afternoon, desperate for cash and facing the prospect of a clean, fast sale. He signed the initial agreement immediately. He had no idea he was selling his last refuge to the ghost he had created. The closing was handled entirely by mail. The final documents arrived at my office via courier a week before the closing date. My assistant brought them in and laid them on my desk. It was a thick stack of papers filled with legal jargon, title reports, and tax forms. But I only cared about the last page, the signature page of the final purchase agreement. There were 2 lines at the bottom. The first had been pre-signed. His signature, which I remembered from the birthday cards he used to sign with a perfunctory flourish, was a mess. It was shaky, thin, the loops and crosses barely coherent, the signature of a hand trembling with stress and defeat. Seller Harold Dane. Below it was the second empty line. Buyer Madison Clark. My name, not an LLC, not a holding company, on this final, internal document, the one that would be filed away in my private records. I wanted the truth. I picked up my pen, a heavy, expensive fountain pen that felt perfectly balanced in my hand. The nib was smooth. My signature, in contrast to his, was fluid, strong, and clear. Each letter was a testament to the woman I had become. I signed my name, the ink a dark, definitive slash across the page. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a verdict. It was an epitaph. He had sold off the last piece of his world, and I had just signed the receipt. The day had a funereal quality to it. Not the day of a death, but the day the will is read and the estate is settled. This was the final walkthrough, the formal transfer of occupancy for 214 Pinecrest. It was a legal necessity. A document stating the previous tenant had vacated the property peaceably. My property. I arrived an hour early. The house was still filled with their things, my mother and Harold's furniture, their pictures on the walls, their life layered over a past I was trying to excavate. It felt like trespassing in 2 timelines at once. I didn't wander through the rooms. I walked directly to the living room and waited. I stood on the very patch of hardwood floor where the wine glass had shattered 12 years ago. The afternoon sun, weak and autumnal, streamed through the large bay window, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. It cast long, distorted shadows across the room, making the familiar space feel alien and strange. The distance from where I stood to the front door seemed immense, a silent stage waiting for the final actor to make his entrance. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I felt a profound, chilling stillness, the calm that comes after a storm that has lasted for more than a decade. He arrived precisely at the scheduled time. I heard his car door shut, the sound muffled and distant. His footsteps on the porch were slow, heavy, the sound of a man walking to his own execution. He used the key he still had, and the lock turned with a soft, final-sounding click. The door swung inward. He stood on the threshold for a long moment, a silhouette against the bright afternoon light. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, plunging the entryway into shadow. He looked smaller. That was the first thing I noticed. The arrogant, broad-shouldered man from my memories had been whittled down by failure and fear. The suit he wore was the same one he'd worn to the HOA meeting, but today it hung on him, the fabric bunching at his shoulders and waist. His face was sallow, etched with lines of exhaustion that hadn't been there a month ago. He looked at me standing by the hearth, and his eyes, once hard and dismissive, were now just tired, defeated. He didn't speak. He just looked around the room, at the furniture he had picked out, at the life he had built, a life that was no longer his. His gaze lingered on the mantelpiece, where a framed photo of him and my smiling mother still stood. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of everything that had happened in this room. Finally, he spoke, his voice a dry rasp. Why? It was the question of a man who still couldn't comprehend his own downfall. He saw himself as the victim, the target of some inexplicable, outsized vendetta. All this time, he continued, his voice cracking with self-pity, all these years, you waited, just to humiliate me. I had anticipated this question. I had rehearsed 100 scathing, furious answers in my mind over the years. But in that moment, looking at the broken man before me, All the fire felt unnecessary. The truth was colder, sharper, and far more effective. "No, Harold," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the empty space between us. "I didn't wait to humiliate you." I paused, letting the words hang in the dusty air. "I waited to own the place you threw me out of." My answer didn't offer him the comfort of a simple, emotional motive. It wasn't about revenge in the way he understood it. It was about reclamation. It was about rewriting the ending of the story he had started. He flinched, the words striking him with more force than any insult could. He seemed to shrink a little more, leaning against the doorframe as if for support. He shook his head, a bitter, contemptuous look passing over his features, a faint echo of the man he used to be. "You'll never understand," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, misplaced moral authority. "You'll never understand forgiveness." There it was, the final, pathetic defense of the guilty to accuse the victim of being unforgiving, to reframe their own cruelty as a moral failing in the one they wronged. A surge of ice-cold clarity washed over me. I looked him straight in the eye. The distance between us seemed to collapse, and for a second, he was the giant and I was the girl again. But the feeling passed. I was the one who owned the ground he stood on. "Forgiveness," I said, my voice precise and clear, "isn't free housing." The statement was a brick wall. It was practical, undeniable, and utterly devoid of the emotion he was trying to manipulate. It took the argument out of the realm of morality and placed it firmly in the world of consequences, a world I now controlled. There was nothing he could say to that. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The last of his arguments turned to ash in his mouth. The fight was gone. There was only the surrender left. I walked over to the small coffee table, where I had placed a single document and a pen. It was the voluntary vacation of premises agreement. I picked up the pen and held it out to him. The space between us was now only a few feet. I could smell the stale scent of his cologne. "Sign," I said. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, but there was no defiance left in him. He walked forward like a man in a trance, his eyes fixed on the pen in my hand. He took it. His hand was trembling violently. He leaned over the table, his body hunched. He found the signature line and tried to sign his name. The pen scratched across the paper, his signature a jagged, almost illegible line. As he straightened up, I saw that his eyes were glistening with tears. One spilled over and traced a path through the tired lines of his face. He looked at me, his last shred of dignity gone, replaced by a raw, pleading vulnerability. "Your mother," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She wouldn't approve of this, of what you've become." It was his last arrow, his final attempt to wound me, to reclaim some sliver of the moral high ground by hiding behind her. He thought her name was a shield he could still use against me. He had no idea she had already surrendered. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a secret meant only for him in this room of ghosts. "She already knows," I said softly. He looked confused, his tear-filled eyes searching mine for meaning. "She sent me the old house keys last month." The impact of those words was absolute. His face crumpled. It was a look of utter, soul-deep betrayal. The knowledge that my mother, his wife, his partner in that silent crime 12 years ago, had been complicit in his undoing was the one blow he hadn't seen coming. He had been utterly and completely alone in his own downfall, and he hadn't even known it. He made a small, wounded sound in the back of his throat, then turned without another word and walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open behind him. I stood there, in the center of my new, old living room, and listened until the sound of his car starting and driving away finally faded into silence. After leaving the house at 214 Pinecrest, I didn't go back to my office. I didn't go back to the shell of 212. I drove. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. But my mind was a maelstrom. Harold's crumpled, betrayed face was seared into my vision. The victory felt hollow. Not wrong. but incomplete. There was one last piece of business to attend to, one final account to settle. I drove away from the manicured lawns and quiet streets of my past and toward a different kind of quiet, a place of hushed whispers and antiseptic endings. The hospice was a low, modern building set back from the road, surrounded by meticulously kept gardens that seemed too vibrant for a place so dedicated to death. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of floor polish and lilies. It was a place designed for peace, but all I felt was a cold, familiar tension coiling in my stomach. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway to room 2B. Her room. She was smaller than I remembered, lost in a sea of white sheets and pillows. The illness had stripped away the years, but not in a kind way. It had taken the soft contours of her face, leaving behind the sharp, brittle structure of her bones. Her hair, which I remembered as a warm brown, was now a thin, silver-white halo against the pillow. Her eyes were closed. An IV stand stood silent sentinel by her bed, its clear tube a fragile lifeline. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway, a stranger looking in on another stranger's final moments. This frail woman was not the mother who had stood by silently in a crowded living room, and I was no longer the daughter who had needed her to speak. We were two different people, separated by a chasm of 12 silent years. I must have made a sound, because her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, searched the room, unfocused at first. Then they found me. Recognition dawned slowly, followed not by surprise, but by a look of weary, inevitable acceptance, as if she had been waiting for me. "Madison," she breathed, her voice a dry, papery whisper. I walked to the side of the bed. The distance felt as vast as the one in the living room had. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to the woman whose silence defined your life? Now that she herself was being consumed by a final, permanent silence. She shifted slightly, a wince of pain crossing her face. She held out a hand, her skin almost translucent, a delicate web of veins and bones. "Come," she whispered. Hesitantly, I reached out and took her hand. It was feather-light and cold, so fragile I felt it might turn to dust in my grasp. Her grip, however, was surprisingly firm, a faint echo of the mother who used to hold my hand to cross the street. "I knew," she said, her eyes holding mine. "I knew you'd come back one day." Her breath hitched. Not to live, not for me, but to finish it. The words were a confession and an absolution all in one. She had known, all this time. She had known the shape of the ghost that haunted her house. She had been waiting for the ending as surely as I had been orchestrating it. The question that had been a hard, bitter knot in my chest for 12 years finally loosened. "Why?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Why did you stay with him that night, all the nights?" Her eyes filled with tears. They didn't fall, just pooled there, making her pale eyes glisten like water in a well. She turned her head, looking away from me, toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. "I was afraid," she whispered to the window pane. "After your father died, I was so afraid of being alone, of not having enough. Harold, he was stable. He was a rock. He made me feel safe." She took a ragged breath, and when she looked back at me, the tears finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her hollowed cheeks. "I thought he could protect us, from the world, from everything. I was so busy looking for the danger outside. I didn't see that he was the danger I had invited inside. By the time I realized, by the time I saw the way he looked at you, it was too late. I was trapped. I was a coward. Madison, I chose my comfort over my child, and I have lived with that every single day." Her confession was not an excuse. It was the plain, unvarnished, ugly truth. It offered no comfort, no easy forgiveness. It was the story of a weak woman who had made a terrible choice and had been paying for it ever since. I looked at her, this shell of my mother, and I felt not anger, not the hot rage of my youth, but a vast, empty sadness. We were both his victims. In the end, he had taken her spirit, and he had taken my childhood. I reached into my pocket and my fingers closed around the cold, familiar metal. I pulled out the old set of house keys to 214 Pinecrest, the ones she had sent me in a small, padded envelope a month ago with no note, a silent signal that her allegiance had, at last, shifted. I gently pried her fingers open and placed the keys in her palm, closing her hand around them. They were heavy, solid, real. "Now you can rest," I said, my voice steady. "He's gone." A small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was the first real smile I had seen from her in my memory. The lines of pain around her eyes seemed to soften. She clutched the keys to her chest, a holy relic. "My house," she whispered. She looked at me, her gaze suddenly sharp, lucid. "Promise me something, Maddie," she said, using my childhood name, a name no one had called me in 12 years. "Promise me you won't become him. All this power. Don't let it make you hard. Don't let it make you cruel." Her words were a mirror, showing me a reflection I hadn't wanted to see. The coldness I had cultivated, the ruthlessness that had made me successful, were they just the other side of Harold's coin? Was my meticulous revenge just a different kind of cruelty? I looked down at our joined hands, her fragile, dying hand holding mine, the hand that had signed the papers and made the calls, the hand that had just evicted a man and broken him. I bowed my head. "No," I said, the word a vow to her, and to myself. "I won't become him." I lifted my head and met her gaze, my own eyes clear and dry. "I'll just be the reminder, a reminder of what happens when men like him think no one is watching." She seemed to understand. She squeezed my hand one last time, a flicker of her old strength, and then her eyes drifted closed, the smile still faintly on her lips. She had found her peace. I sat with her for another hour, holding her hand as she slipped into a deep, untroubled sleep, the keys to her house resting over her heart. A week later, my assistant called to inform me that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The hospice had her listed as my next of kin. I handled the arrangements with a quiet, efficient grief. I chose a simple cremation, a small service with no one but myself in attendance. I did not call Harold. I did not send a message. He had no right to mourn the woman he had spent years slowly erasing. He had forfeited that right in a silent living room 12 years ago. But I knew he would receive the news. His 30 days to vacate the property were almost up. The final notice from my lawyers, the cold, legally binding eviction letter, was already in the mail. It would arrive on his doorstep any day now. It would be his inheritance. It would be her final message. The letter was a masterpiece of corporate brutality, drafted by the sharpest lawyer in my firm. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored letterhead bearing the name of Northwood Holdings, LLC. There was no greeting, no salutation, just a cold, clear heading, "Final notice to vacate premises." I had reviewed it a dozen times, ensuring every trace of human emotion had been scrubbed from its text. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated logic. The key sentence was in the first paragraph, "Per the terms outlined in Section 8.3 of the legally executed property transfer agreement, and in accordance with state tenancy at will statutes, you are hereby given final notice that the current occupant must vacate the property located at 214 Pinecrest Street within 5 business days of receipt of this certified letter." It went on to detail the consequences of non-compliance formal eviction proceedings, the involvement of local law enforcement, and the occupant's liability for all associated legal fees. I didn't add a single personal word. There was no note of condolence for my mother's passing, no acknowledgement of our shared history. It was a document designed to erase him, to render him nothing more than an occupant in breach of contract. I sent it via certified mail, requiring his signature upon receipt. The digital confirmation that he had signed for it arrived in my inbox 2 days later. He came that evening. The sun had already set, and the streetlights of Pinecrest cast a pale, sickly orange glow. I was at 212, which was now a clean, empty shell of drywall and new subflooring, waiting for the fixtures and finishes to arrive. I was watching him through the newly installed picture window that looked directly across the small lawn to the front door of 214. I saw his car pull up, saw him get out. He didn't come to my door. He went to his own, the one he no longer had a right to, and stood on the porch. A piece of paper, my letter clutched in his hand. He looked lost. Then, he seemed to gather himself and walked with a determined, desperate stride across the grass to my front door. This time, he didn't pound. He knocked 3 times, a sharp, urgent rap that spoke of a man with no other options. I let him wait for a full minute, watching his silhouette through the glass. Then I opened the door. He looked terrible. The past few weeks had hollowed him out, carving deep, shadowed lines into his face. His eyes were red-rimmed and frantic. He held up the letter as if it were a foreign object he couldn't comprehend. "I have nowhere to go," he said, the words a raw, broken plea. The arrogance was gone, the authority stripped away, leaving only the terrified core of the man. "Madison, please, I have nothing left. No money. I have nowhere to take your mother's things. Just a little more time." He was trying to appeal to a daughter's sentiment, to a shared grief that he had no right to invoke. He was using her memory as his last shield. I felt nothing, no pity, no sympathy, just the cold, clean finality of a long overdue equation being solved. "You had 12 years, I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as the new foundation of the house I stood in. 12 years to build somewhere else, 12 years to save, to plan, to become someone who wouldn't end up on a doorstep with a letter in his hand. That's a long time. Harold, what did you do with it?" My words weren't meant to be cruel. They were a simple statement of fact. His predicament was not my creation. It was the result of 1,000 choices he had made, starting with the one he made in the living room of that house. He stared at me, the hope in his eyes dying, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He finally saw that there was no well of human kindness here for him to draw from. I was not a person to him anymore. I was a consequence. He looked down at the letter, then back up at me, his face twisting into a mask of bitter resentment. The victimhood was his last refuge. "So this is it, then," he spat, his voice trembling with a weak, impotent rage. "You waited this long just to win, just to stand here and watch me lose everything." He wanted to frame it as a game. He needed me to be the villain who had pursued him out of spite, because the alternative that he had done this to himself was a truth he couldn't bear to face. I held his gaze, my own unwavering. "No," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his anger. "I waited this long to remember." He didn't understand. I didn't expect him to. For me, this was never about winning. It was about refusing to forget. It was about ensuring that what he did, what my mother allowed, was not simply erased by time. It was about building a monument to that memory, a monument made of deeds and lawsuits and eviction notices. I said nothing more. The silence was my final answer. He stood there for another moment, the letter trembling in his hand. Then he crumpled it into a ball in his fist. He turned without another word and walked away, a man erased from his own life. When the sound of his car had faded, I walked across the lawn and stepped through the open door of 214 Pinecrest, my house. His scent still lingered in the air, a faint mix of stale coffee and cheap cologne. The rooms were filled with the detritus of his and my mother's life together, but I ignored it all. I walked to the living room, to the far wall next to the hearth, the wall I had leaned against after he struck me, my 16-year-old body coiled in shock and pain, trying to become invisible. I remembered the rough texture of the wallpaper against my cheek, the way I had pressed myself into the corner, as if the wall itself could absorb my shame. I stood in that exact spot now, but I did not lean. I stood tall, my shoulders back, my feet planted firmly on the floorboards I now owned. I was no longer trying to disappear. I was taking up space. I was the one who belonged here. The next day, My assistant delivered a package. Inside was the final purchase agreement for the house, the one with his trembling signature and my firm, clear one. I had had it professionally framed. The frame was simple, black metal. The matting was a stark white. It was not an object of art or sentiment. It was a legal artifact, a trophy. I took a hammer and a nail and walked back into the living room. I stood before that wall, the wall of my humiliation, and I hammered the nail firmly into the plaster. With a quiet, satisfying click, I hung the frame, his defeat, my victory, captured under cold, reflective glass. It was the new centerpiece of the room. It was the first thing anyone would see upon entering. It was a reminder. I stepped back to admire my work. As I did, my phone, which I had placed on the mantelpiece, vibrated. The screen lit up with an email notification. It was from the Pinecrest HOA. My finger hovered over the screen. Then I tapped it open. The subject line was simple: an official welcome. The body was just as brief. Dear Ms. Clark, following the recent board restructuring and the special election, we are pleased to inform you that the board has voted unanimously to approve your nomination. Welcome, Ms. Clark, our new HOA Vice President. I stared at the screen, at the title, his title, the small, pathetic crown he had worn with so much pride. It had been passed to me, the new ruler of the kingdom he had been exiled from. A slow, quiet laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't a sound of joy or triumph. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated irony. Destiny, it seemed, had a truly vicious sense of humor. The clubhouse felt different under my authority. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same faint scent of chlorine hung in the air. But the atmosphere was charged with a new, deferential silence. As the homeowners filed in for the first meeting I would chair, they didn't look at me as a stranger or a curiosity anymore. They looked at me with a careful, measured respect that bordered on fear. I sat at the head of the long, folding table, the same table where Harold had held court, but I didn't pace or preen. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on a single, slim file. The seat of power, I was discovering, was most effective when it was quiet. The meeting was a dull affair, a debate over landscaping contracts, a discussion about patching the cracks in the community pool. I conducted it with a cool, detached efficiency, my voice even, my rulings on procedural points quick and final. I was the very picture of impartial governance. Throughout the proceedings, I was aware of the door at the back of the room, acutely conscious of every time it opened or closed. It was near the end of the meeting, during a tedious debate about the approved holiday decoration schedule, that the door opened one last time. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't a gasp, just a collective intake of breath, a subtle shift in the room's energy that I felt in my bones. I didn't need to look. I knew it was him. I continued speaking, my voice not wavering in the slightest. The motion to extend the decoration period until the second week of January is noted. We will now move to a vote. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Harold stood just inside the doorway, a ghost in the house he used to haunt. He was wearing a worn tweed jacket, and in his hands, he twisted the brim of an old soft cap, turning it over and over again in a gesture of profound anxiety. He did not look at me. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, a man trying to make himself as small as possible, to take up no space at all. He was a trespasser in his own memory. The meeting concluded. I brought the gavel down with a soft, definitive tap. This meeting is adjourned. Chairs scraped against the floor as residents began to gather their things, their conversations starting up in low murmurs. They cast furtive, curious glances toward the back of the room, toward the man who had been their leader and the woman who had deposed him. I remained seated, arranging the papers in my file with deliberate precision. People filed past, offering polite nods, and, "Good meeting, Ms. Clark." I acknowledged each of them with a small, reserved smile. I knew Harold was waiting. This was his purpose for coming. He needed one last thing from me. When the room was nearly empty, he began his slow walk forward. He didn't approach the head table directly, but stopped a respectful 10 feet away, still standing while I remained seated. He had the posture of a petitioner before a queen. He cleared his throat. It was a small, nervous sound. "Ms. Clark," he began, his voice low, almost inaudible. I looked up from my file, my expression neutral. He faltered for a moment under my direct gaze. Then he asked the question that had brought him here, the question that was about so much more than a homeowners association. "Do I still belong here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't looking at me, but at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. His question hung in the silent, empty room. He was asking for permission, for a place, for a right to exist in the same small universe I now commanded. He was asking if the girl he had locked out would now lock him in. I considered him for a long moment. I could have banished him. I could have said no. I could have twisted the knife of his exile just a little deeper, but that would have been his kind of power, personal, emotional, cruel. Mine was different. "Everyone does," I replied, my voice as cool and impersonal as a line of code in a bylaw. "If they follow the rules." It was not an act of mercy, it was a life sentence. I was granting him permission to exist, but only as a non-entity, a common resident bound by the same regulations he had once lorded over others. He would belong only as long as he remained invisible, compliant, and utterly powerless. I had taken his name and his house. Now I was giving him back the rules, no longer as a weapon for him to wield, but as a cage to live in. He seemed to understand the profound finality of the verdict. A barely perceptible nod was his only response, an acceptance. He turned then, without another word, and walked the long walk back to the door. His shoulders slumped, his cap still clutched in his hands. I watched him through the large glass window of the clubhouse as he walked across the parking lot. His shadow stretched long and thin in the light from the street lamp. Then it blended into the greater darkness and was gone. For a single, fleeting moment, as his shadow disappeared, something inside me stirred, a strange, unfamiliar impulse, a flicker of pity for the pathetic, broken man he had become, a thought, faint as a whisper. Forgive him, let it go. But then, as if summoned by the thought, I heard it, the sound, not in my ears, but in my memory, as sharp and clear as the day it happened, the clean, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place, a sound of absolute finality, a sound that had echoed through every success, every victory, every cold and lonely night for the past 12 years. And with the sound came the words, spoken in his voice, dripping with casual contempt, "She can wait outside." The flicker of pity died, extinguished by the cold wave of memory. Forgiveness was a luxury for people who hadn't been locked out of their own lives. I looked down at the file on the table in front of me. With a slow, deliberate motion, I closed it. The cover made a soft, definitive thud in the quiet room. The debate was over. The case was closed. A voice, my own, spoke in the silence of my mind, clear and cold and certain. "Now, you're the one inside." The night was deep and silent, the way it only gets in the suburbs long after the last television has been turned off. I sat on the small second-floor balcony of 214 Pinecrest, a space that had once been my mother's, overlooking the quiet, sleeping street. The air was cool and carried the clean, sharp scent of new paint and freshly turned earth from the landscaping I'd had installed. The renovation of 212 was complete, a gleaming testament to my victory next door. This house, my house, was next. For now, it was an empty, echoing space, scrubbed clean of the past, waiting for a new life to begin. I held a glass of wine, the same deep red Merlot from that long-ago night, and watched the streetlights. They cast lonely pools of orange on the pavement, their reflections warping and sliding across the dark glass of the balcony door like scattered, liquid memories. For 12 years, I had run on the cold, high-octane fuel of anger. Every success, every acquisition, every step forward was a step away from the girl who had been cast out. My entire life had been a meticulously constructed fortress against the memory of that locked door. Now, the war was over, the enemy was vanquished, the territory secured, and in the silence that followed, I felt still. Not happy, not sad, just a quiet, profound stillness. The feeling of a long and heavy weight being set down at last. I had won so completely that the rage that had fueled me for so long had nothing left to burn. It had simply gone out, leaving this calm, empty peace in its wake. My phone, resting on the small wrought iron table beside me, suddenly vibrated. The buzz was a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet of the night. It lit up, displaying an email notification against the dark screen. It was the same email from the HOA, the one welcoming me as the new vice president. I had read it a dozen times already, but I opened it again, just to see the words, to feel the finality of them. Welcome, Ms. Clark. His title, now mine. His seat at the table, now mine. His community, now mine. My thumb swiped across the screen, closing the email and navigating to my photo gallery. I stopped on a picture I had taken, a high-resolution scan of the last page of the cabin's purchase agreement. It was my favorite trophy. I zoomed in, my eyes tracing the two signatures at the bottom of the page. The first was his, Seller Harold Dane, a spidery, broken scrawl, the signature of a man signing away the last piece of himself. Below it, mine, buyer Madison Clark, a strong, confident script, the signature of a woman claiming what was hers. I stared at his name, this relic of a man who now lived in a small, rented apartment on the other side of town, a man who had been erased from his own life by his own hand, with me as the instrument of that erasure. Was this what victory felt like? This quiet, this stillness, this looking at a ghost's name on a digital screen. I lowered the phone, and as my thumb moved to the side of the device to put it to sleep, the screen went dark. In the deep silence of the night, the phone emitted a soft, clean sound. Ping. It was the sound of the screen locking, a simple, digital, everyday noise, but in that moment, in that place, it was transformed. It was the exact pitch, the same sharp finality, as the click of a deadbolt sliding home in a well-oiled lock. It was the sound I had heard from the other side of the door 12 years ago, the sound that had separated my life into a before and an after, the sound that had cast me out. But this time, the sound had come from my hand, from my device, from my side of the door. The lock had clicked shut, but I was the one inside. I was the one in the warmth and the light, looking out into the darkness where the ghosts of the past resided. He was the one who was gone. He was the one left to wait outside. A slow smile spread across my face, not of triumph, not of joy, but of a deep, final, and absolute resolution. I looked out at the dark, quiet street and spoke the words aloud, a whisper to the night, a final answer to a question that had haunted me for half my life. She can wait outside, at any more. The screen was dark. The story was over. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on Madison's journey. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please press that hype button. Your support means the world.